Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. We're just about to take a look at another old classic from a way back in the day, but just a little heads up as to what's coming up soon here on my channel. Now, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be heading out and about once again to cover another outdoor event, which will of course be the Scottish Classic Round 4 event, which will be held at Strathallan near Falkirk, and that's all happening on Sunday the 8th of September. And of course we'll bring you all of the bikes from around the paddock and all of the racing action on the track. Now, also in late September we will be heading across the pond to the good old US of A for our annual vacation. So I'm heading over to the Sunshine State of Orlando in Florida for a 2-week vacation with the family. So who knows, we may even bump into one or two of my YouTube subscribers over there in the USA. So right, let's get down to business now and let's take a look at this other long lost classic. And this next feature bike is a bike that I filmed at the Scottish Motorcycle Show just a few years back. So let's get straight into the video now and take a look at Stewart Roden's lovely 1973 500 CCM. Right, thanks for joining me once again. Now, this featured British classic is another Stewart Roden built bike, and if you're a regular visitor to my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, then you may have already seen a few examples from Stewart's collection that I've posted down the years here on my YouTube site. And this is another one that I actually filmed at the Scottish Motorcycle Show a few years back. So this bike here is the very first model that Alan Clews produced, and although this bike here is maybe not a fully 100% stock machine, it's still based on the 1973 bike. Now, Stewart back in the 1970s certainly did race these old CCMs when many of the big stars of their day were thundering around the tracks of the UK, taking on the best of the European two-strokers of their time. And in fact, Stewart was quite a good friend of the late Alan Clews, and Stewart regularly made visits to the CCM factory in Bolton to pick up parts and have some repairs done to certain components. And in these couple of pictures here, you can see Stewart pictured beside another one of his classic CCMs, but currently Stewart is recovering from quite a bad spill that he suffered at the Scottish Classic Round 3 event that was being held at Bassenthwaite near Penrith a few weeks back. So we certainly all wish Stewart very well and hope he makes a super quick recovery and is back to full fitness as soon as possible. But during his early days of his racing career, Stewart eventually took a break from racing the Clews Classics when he started to get involved in Formula One car racing, and he then later set up his own prestige car repair business servicing high-end vehicles like Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Porsches. But of course, as in all of these kind of cases, the lure of getting back to racing bikes is always strong, and Stewart once again appeared to get the bug once more and began building replica versions of some of those great bikes that he raced as a younger man in those fantastic and golden days of the 1970s, when of course the sport at that time was still called scrambling and not motocross as it's known today. So when it came to actually building this bike, Stewart already had in his workshop loads of parts, including B50 engines and other CCM bits and pieces, which were all collected and kept from his days racing these bikes back in the 1970s. And although Stewart still needed to locate certain parts to complete the bike, he still had an Aladdin's cave of Alan Clews spares that he could use. So things were certainly starting to come together when a short inventory of parts were collated to build some sort of Clews kind of tribute bike. And although this bike is certainly based on the 1973 model, Stewart's still added a few personal touches of his own. So beginning with the bike's chassis, and although this may look a little bit shiny for a 51-year-old CCM frame, this is still the real deal from that year, but it's just that the chassis here has been re-chromed just to give it a fresh look, and this was an original frame and rear swing arm that Stewart still had in his workshop from his days racing these bikes on the track. And also, as per many of the other CCMs of their day, these 73s also had their engine oil stored in the frame's front down tube, where it would then pass through a small gauze filter at the bottom of the chassis, and then the oil would get pumped around the engine before then being sent back into the top of the chassis through a small return pipe just on the side of the filler plug here in front of the fuel tank. But moving down onto the power source of our 73 Clews Classic. Now, when Stewart decided to build an engine to slot into his 73 chassis, he managed to source a set of bottom end crankcases that were being offered for sale on the internet at a bargain price. So those cases were basically the basis to build an engine for this bike, because Stewart already had most of the other parts that he needed in his vast CCM cave of spare parts. So basically this engine here is a 500 B50 MX motor, which is of course the 2-valve top end, and this engine here also has a 3-speed transmission inside. Now, as you know, the great Alan Clews had that brilliant idea of using the engine's casings to mount the footrest hangers and consequently the footrests themselves. Although these items here aren't the Clews originals, these are wider replacements to the simple tubular steel pegs that would have been fitted to this engine back in 1973. Now, you may also have spotted that the short gear shifter is missing on this engine, and that's because Stewart was actually still in the process of completing the bike the night before it was placed on display here at the Scottish Motorcycle Show. Now, this particular barrel here on this B50 BSA engine, you can see that it's had the now popular upgrade of having every second cooling fin removed, which certainly reduces a bit of weight, and I think it also helps to prevent mud jamming between the fins if the bike's being raced in a sticky, muddy kind of race event. But in terms of fueling, the engine is fed its fuel through an Amel concentric carburetor, and the sparks for the ignition are by way of a self-contained and removable interspan ignition system. But without question, these B50 old BSA power plants are a decent engine once you get them all sorted and set up correctly. And if you can get a decent rider in the saddle of one of these CCMs, then they're more than capable of running with similar sized 500 two-strokers. So as we move into the engine's exhaust department, now this pipe here, as you know, was just a simple straight through big bore pipe, And this featured exhaust pipe here isn't the 73 original, although Stewart did have one in his workshop, but it was pretty well damaged and quite rusted, so Stewart simply copied the original 73 pipe and made this one himself. And then he also had it chrome plated, as of course the originals were back in the day. Now, to complete the big CCM's exhaust system, Stewart's also made this replica tail cone as well, which is almost indistinguishable from the Clews factory part. But as we make our way around the bike and move onto the front, we still have the stock original magnesium yokes, or triple clamps, or triple trees, as some people like to call them. But these magnesium parts here are very hard to come by now in this modern day, and Alan Clews certainly did use a certain amount of magnesium on these bikes in the early 1970s. And in the 1973 500 CCM suspension department, we have the original BSA front forks, because this 73 model, as I said, was the very first real Clews competition machine to be made, and Alan Clews simply took the original BSA forks and then modified them to use on his early scrambles racers. And of course, in those early years that followed, Clews would also go on to eventually design and build his own front forks to fit to his CCM racers. And here once again we have more super rare magnesium parts with the front and the rear hubs, and as I mentioned, it's almost unheard of to still come across these rare and original components nowadays, and that's why when you see or even build a replica or remanufactured CCM bikes, you have to use other kind of more common parts, like maybe CZ hubs or even machined micro hubs, because these stock original magnesium items are just so hard to find. But if you do happen to come across one or two magnesium items like this, then they usually will command very good money. And in fact, even both of the brake backplates on this Stewart Roden bike are the original CCM parts, which again are quite rare to see on one of these older four-strokers. Although everything else on this bike has had a nice fresh paint job done, including this rear hub and of course the original front and rear steel wheels, which were a common fixture of its day. So back in those golden days of 1973, it would have been a pretty basic pair of girdling dampers that would have been bolted onto the back of these CCMs, which for their day weren't that great, but that was your suspension technology of its time, so you didn't really have much in the way of choice. And besides, I'm pretty sure that Girling were a CCM sponsor at one time, so I can certainly understand why they were used on these CCMs. But you can see that in this modern day, we're actually spoilt for choice in that regard, and you can see that Stewart's opted to fit a pair of classic Swedish-made piggyback Öhlins to this particular build, because after all, Stewart intends to race this bike and not use it as simply a nice shiny showpiece. Now, the fuel tank on Stewart's CCM is a slightly bigger than the standard alloy tank that would have been used on these 73 bikes, which I can only assume it was made just to allow more fuel capacity for longer races. But again, it's all painted in the correct colour of its day with the proper CCM logo on the side there, and the stock Monza style locking fuel cap there on the top as well. But by now you've probably all guessed that this bike's seat is not the correct item for 73, because CCM would never have made them with this amount of padding or even quality. But this seat here, it still uses the original seat base, but the foam padding and the custom made cover was all manufactured by Transcal Engineering, who make all manner of components for the automotive industry. And this superbly crafted seat was made right here in Scotland. So although it's not the slim black vinyl seat that Alan Clews fitted in 73, this is still a very high quality item, and very comfortable as well, as you can imagine. So as we move on to the plastics on our 73, which I'm pretty sure are all CCM items, but probably remanufactured parts, because pattern copies of the original CCM bodywork are now being manufactured once again. So things like side panels and airboxes and number plates and front and rear mudguards are usually readily available to keep your old thumper looking nice and fresh. But certainly the parts bolted onto our 73 are pretty much what would have been fitted to the factory machines, although those parts in that year would have been made in the much more brittle fiberglass. And as I remember, I think it was a man called Stan Tranter who in 1973 manufactured all of the fiberglass body panels exclusively for Alan Clews at CCM. But there was one other little interesting piece of trivia about the CCM company name, was that Alan Clews, as you know, originally called his company CCM, although there was also a Canadian company with the exact same title who were at that time making things like cycle equipment, and they took a bit of offence to Alan Clews's choice of company name. So rather than get into any kind of legal litigation in the courts, Alan simply then added Britain to his logo, which solved that particular issue. So as we move up to the front of the bike, it of course has period correct Doherty grips, Magura alloy levers, and of course their associated vinyl lever covers as well. And the yellow control cables that you see there are obviously replacement Ven Hill items. And once again, the bike's handlebars are the genuine CCM items, and these have been fully restored by Stewart, because I think they originally had some kind of damage on them and needed a bit of slight repair and a new paint job to bring them back to life. And as you can expect, finding original parts such as these is certainly not easy, so Stewart's kind of glad that he built up a stock of spare parts while he was still racing back in the 1970s. But as I mentioned earlier in this video, this of course was Alan Clews's first real CCM model, although he certainly did build a bike prior to this in 1972, which he called the Clews Stroker. And in this short clip here, you can see a lovely example of one of Alan's first off-road bikes, and this 1972 bike here is yet another superb example from the Ian Ridley classic motorcycle collection.
But certainly this bike here was in the very early days of the Clews dynasty, and not a lot of these strokers were actually made, although they were very popular with riders, and they did sell quite well. And it was really the popularity and the interest in these strokers that actually led Alan Clews in late 1972 to register the name Clews Competition Machines. And the actual title Machines rather than Motorcycles was chosen because Alan wasn't too sure if the business was actually going to be a success, so he chose the word machines instead of motorcycles, just in case things didn't work out and he had to diversify into some other kind of manufacturing. And when you take a look at this fantastic bike and see the quality of its design and build, then the seeds were well and truly sown for the new CCM factory. But when these 1973 models took to the UK's tracks in that year, to say that they were a revelation would be a bit of an understatement, especially when you had the likes of the great Norman Barrow and Scotsman Jimmy Aird, and of course the Sabden warrior himself, the legendary Bob Wright, who were all works riders on these machines in 1973. And with all of their race successes on the tracks, that naturally led to many more orders for motorcycles from the Bolton factory. So, although Stewart's 1973 here isn't a fully stock bike from that year, apart from, of course, his customised seat and a couple of other little changes, this is still a very good rendition of what you'd actually get if you put an order in for a CCM off-roader in that year. And in the following decades to come, Alan Clews and his CCM Motorcycles company would certainly go on to build some of the best four-stroke race bikes, not only in the UK, but in Europe as well. Right, so coming up next here on CDB TV, we're out in the field once again to cover round 4 of the Scottish Classic Club's 2024 Championship, which will be held at Strathallan near Falkirk. So make sure that you either subscribe to my channel or just return to take a look at all the bikes and the action from that event. So again, thanks for watching. Until the next time, it's goodbye for now.